While California's high-speed rail appears to be ready to start construction on the initial 29-mile segment from Madera to Fresno, there are critics who charge that the bidding process is flawed, delays and cost overruns will only mount, and the money will never be there to build it. As a result, they want to stop high-speed rail in its tracks. Supporters, such as Governor Brown, say it is a critical piece of California's future infrastructure and must be built, beginning in the San Joaquin Valley. We'll examine what is happening as the first segment is about to be built, and we'll discuss some of the short and long-term challenges that could delay or derail California's bullet train with Mike Brady, one of the attorneys representing the Hanford residents who want to stop high-speed rail, and Jeff Morales, the CEO of California's High-Speed Rail Authority. High-speed rail, will it be derailed?
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. A project as large as high-speed rail is bound to stir some controversy. The responsibility of our guest, Jeff Morales, the CEO of the High-Speed Rail Authority, is to make sure it doesn't derail in the process. So welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
Well, why don't you give our audience a quick update on the current status of high-speed rail?
Sure. Well, we've had a very busy, productive year over the last year. Last summer, we got the green light to move ahead with the project. The legislature approved the first funding to move into actual design and construction of the project. We've moved ahead very aggressively since then. We've received our first environmental approvals. We got federal approval to begin construction of the program. We've worked with stakeholders to settle some of the lawsuits that were out there and work through those issues. We've begun work with our partners on the peninsula to electrify the Caltrain corridor and are working in Southern California with our partners to invest in rail there. And we've awarded our first major design-build contract for construction in the Central Valley, so we are underway.
That's that 29-mile segment from Fresno to
Madera,
essentially.
Right,
okay.
Yes.
It was reported recently that you reached an agreement with Union Pacific. What does that cover?
Union Pacific is one of the two railroads that is along our alignment throughout the state, and so we have to reach agreement with them to ensure that we can do our work safely and on a timely basis, and also that we can keep their operations up and running during all of that. So we had to work through agreements with them to ensure that all of that commerce can keep moving.
You know, there was a concern several months back that no deal had been struck with Burlington Northern Santa Fe, BNSF, which operates a freight line, I guess, along most of the 130-mile route in the Central Valley. Is there any progress on that?
Yes, we are working with the BNSF as we had with the Union Pacific. We're working through the details. I expect that we'll have an agreement with them very shortly and in time for us to begin work.
Yeah, people I think were a little surprised by that because BNSF had been generally supportive of the project. Was that your understanding, at least initially?
Yeah, this isn't a question of support or opposition. I think they need to make sure that they're looking out for their interest in terms of their operating concerns, their long-term concerns about expansion. So it's really just a matter of working through those issues. There's no opposition or no reason to be concerned.
You also, the authority recently approved $69 million to relocate utility cables on the 29-mile Fresno-Madera segment. Was this a surprise? Was this already in the budget?
Now, this was always built in and always assumed. Anytime you're building any sort of infrastructure project, a road, a rail, anything, there are utilities in the way, whether it's...
You find surprises.
You find surprises, and, well, hopefully not too many. You find some, certainly, but we also know that there are, electric lines out there, gas lines, other water lines, things like that, and those all have to be either moved or temporarily or permanently, and so we budget that into the process.
It's kind of like remodeling a house, right? You take down a wall and you find things you didn't expect.
We try to minimize the surprises, but right, you never know what might be out there.
The authorities board also recently approved establishing a contingency fund of $160 million to cover potential cost overruns for unanticipated expenses and risks. Does this mean you're concerned about cost overruns?
No, we have really what is a state-of-the-art program for risk management to identify things that we may encounter during the course of construction that can't necessarily be quantified at the front end of the process. And we identify those risks, determine how real the risks are, and assign a value to them. And then we work to manage them. That's what that contingency fund is. Every public works project has a contingency attached to it. That's what our board just approved. It just allows us to manage the program.
So they put like a certain percentage of money aside for the what-ifs, just in case?
Exactly, because as you've noted, you can't predict everything that's out there. And so there are always unknowns that come up during the course of a project. Our job is to manage those unknowns as much as possible.
Initially there was some concern about the institutional capacity of the authority, basically staffing.
Right.
How has that issue been addressed?
That's something we've moved very aggressively on, and it was a concern last year, certainly when the legislature voted. We have, over the course of the last just over a year, grown from about 24 people to 80. We've brought on some very highly specialized technical people. One of them, for instance, the former chief engineer for Amtrak nationally, is now part of our program. We filled out our entire team. We have people out in the field, and that's paid real dividends in our relationships with stakeholders and other things.
Okay. Well, while high-speed rail tries to stay on track, there's a lawsuit that's been filed to try to stop high-speed rail in its tracks. The conversation with the attorney who filed that lawsuit in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Our next guest is Mike Brady, the attorney representing the Hanford plaintiffs who are suing to stop high-speed rail. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you very much.
Well, first question is, what is the basis for your lawsuit? What are your claims?
Well, we started this lawsuit back in November 2011. We had been trying to get high-speed rail starting in 2009, 2010 to comply with the law that was passed in 2008 to no avail. And so we were forced to come into court and file this lawsuit trying to get them to comply with the provisions that we were claiming were violated. So what our lawsuit is, it's divided into two parts. Part one alleges two particular violations of Prop 1A, and then a later part, which will be tried in about 6 months, is the taxpayer standing part, and that involves 6 more violations.
What are the two claims that you're making?
Yes, those two that have already been ruled on by the judge in our favor. One is environmental and one is funding. The funding one is probably the most important because Prop 1A said that the authority can't start construction until they have all the money in the bank sufficient to complete the whole segment that they selected. So they selected a segment back in November that goes all the way from Merced to the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles County. That costs $31 billion. But all they have to spend on it, all the money that they have committed is $6 billion, only 20% of what they need. The reason they can't get more than 6 is because Prop 1A says no money can come out of Prop 1A unless there's matching funds. There's only $3 billion in federal funds, so only $3 billion can come out of Prop 1A. So the judge on August 16 issued a ruling saying you're in violation of that provision. You don't have the money that you need to have before you can start, and we hope that he's going to say they can't start. The second part of the ruling of the judge on August 16 that is in our favor, it concerns environmental. The legislature very wisely said, look, as of November of 2011, you have to have completed all the environmental clearances for the whole 300-mile segment that you selected. You have to have completed them all. The authority rather arrogantly said, well, we can't do that, but we promise you we'll have finished them all, have completed all the environmental clearances before we start construction. The judge said, that's not sufficient.
Okay, so the judge ruled in your favor, so
he did.
But he didn't stop the project. He asked both sides to submit arguments about what legal remedies they'd want for the violation. So what kind of remedies are you asking for?
The remedies hearing is November the 8th. That's a very important hearing. And remedies means what is the judge going to order? Now that he has found violations, he did find that these two matters I mentioned, environmental and funding, were violations. The remedy would be what order is he going to issue, and we have asked him to issue, in effect, an injunction preventing the authority from starting any construction, preventing the authority from spending any money, preventing the authority from spending any money on construction, preventing the authority from entering into any contracts. that provide for the building of the high-speed rail project until the authority satisfies the judge that they have complied with Proposition 1A and have cured the violations that the judge said existed.
But they could still spend the money on land acquisition and project design, correct?
They could still spend some of the money provided they don't reach a cap. There's a cap or a ceiling on what they can spend for those activities. But we're even asking the judge to enjoin some of those activities for reasons that are set forth in the briefs that have been filed.
Perhaps a silly question, but is there any room for compromise here, or is this an all-or-nothing situation?
Well, you know, for about a year and a half, we tried to get the authority to comply with the law. Because after all, the whole purpose of this suit is just to make the state comply with its own laws. And they just refused to do so in 8 different respects, or 8 separate violations that are part of this suit. So I don't see a basis for compromise. Every time you try to get them to comply, they just ignore you. In fact, after the judge's ruling in our favor on August 16, the governor announced it makes no difference, we're going ahead with the project, and the head of the authority said this decision doesn't apply to us. I don't know how he could say that, but that's what he said.
What if the judge doesn't stop the project or doesn't give the remedy that you're seeking, the injunction? What's your next move?
Well, we have a very important phase of the case, which will probably go to trial in about 6 months. Some of the same issues will be tried in that because those parts of the case are somewhat different. They have a different burden of proof and so forth. And then there are entirely separate violations that are involved. And we may have a jury trial, which would be interesting in that phase of the case. But just to give you one example, Proposition 1A says no subsidy can be provided for operating costs for this high-speed rail. Now, every high-speed rail system in the world gets a massive government subsidy. How is California's going to be any different? And if they can't prove that they're not going to get a subsidy, they can't build it. The other very important part of that case says you have to be able to get the passenger from LA to San Francisco in 2 hours and 40 minutes. To do that, they have the train, their chief engineer has the train coming down the Tehachapi Mountains, down for 20 miles at 225 miles an hour. Now, I would like to ask your listeners, what passenger would get on a train going down a mountain at 225 miles an hour?
Well, I guess we're going to find out. I want to thank Attorney Mike Brady for joining us. Up next, we'll hear from the High-Speed Rail Authority. What is their response? We've had a conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're rejoined by Jeff Morales, CEO of the High-Speed Rail Authority. So how do you respond to the plaintiff's claims regarding lack of funding, incomplete environmental reviews, and that use of a blended system is going to violate Prop 1A?
Well, we don't agree, obviously, with those.
Well, if you did, that would be news.
That would be news, yes. No, we're moving forward in a way that makes sense to implement a program like this and in accord with the requirements of Prop 1A and other laws that have been passed. We have funding in hand to build our first segment. That's what we're moving forward with. That's what we have the federal approvals for. We're complying with all the requirements of the law, and the blended system is something. Plan always called for slower speeds in the urban areas, up the San Francisco Peninsula, for instance. One of the things we did over the last year, which really makes a lot of sense for everyone, including the taxpayers, is look at ways to make this system work better, faster,
You saved
cheaper.
a lot of money using that blended
We saved an awful lot of money. We would have spent, just for example, on the San Francisco Peninsula, to build a dedicated infrastructure.
Our viewers, just so they understand.
Sure. The vast majority of our system will be dedicated new infrastructure over which only the high-speed trains will run. In the urban areas, and in the San Francisco Peninsula, for instance, we will share facilities with Caltrain, the existing commuter rail. But we will electrify that system and upgrade it in order to allow us to achieve the requirements we need there. But it's really making better use of existing resources, saving literally billions of dollars.
Now, the judge, you lost initially in this lawsuit that's been filed by the folks from Hanford, but he said he didn't stop the project. He said he wanted the folks to come back and make some suggested remedies. What are you suggesting that the court do?
Well, first, I would take some exception with the idea that we lost. I think there was a ruling on one phase at one point of time in the project about the submission of an initial plan, which then ultimately was modified and considered by the legislature. And so when they ultimately voted, they were voting on something very different than what had been submitted. The process allows for that and assumes that. The judge made it very clear that the legislature has the authority to act, to modify the plans, and to appropriate the funds. The plaintiffs asked for him to stop the project based on that. He specifically said no. He said that he has no authority to inject himself in the legislature's business.
So what are you going to suggest the judge do?
Well, we believe there is no remedy because there was no wrong, in that the wrong was corrected through the process. We're going to continue to comply with the law and make sure that this program can move forward in a responsible manner.
Again, I asked Mike this, I'll ask you the same question. Is there any chance for a compromise here, or is this an all or nothing situation?
I guess in light of what's going on in Washington these days, compromise is a tricky thing to come by, but we're always open to discussion and compromise. I think that's been evidenced. We had CEQA lawsuits in Merced and Madera counties that we settled by working with the affected parties and came to an agreement there. We've done the same thing elsewhere. So, I think the real question is, do the people on the other side, to Mr. Brady and those, what are they really after? And I think if they want to stop the project, that's probably not something that can be compromised on. Our job is to move forward with the program that the voters approved.
What if the judge does something that you find just untenable, then what?
We're still in the legal process. I'm not going to speculate on what he might do. We don't think, again, we don't see things there that would be problematic for us. He said specifically he will not try to overturn the appropriation. We are moving forward very much in accord with what the legislature did.
What about this bond validation case that the same Superior Court judge is going to be hearing? What's that about? What is a bond validation
Sure.
case?
Proposition 1A, among other things, it set out the authority for the state to move forward and begin the construction of high-speed rail and authorize the issuance of bonds to do that, almost $10 billion worth of bonds altogether. The bond validation is an action to ensure that legal challenges to those bonds get heard, and get heard at one time, so that we can clear the issues and move forward and not be subject to repeated lawsuits.
Okay, what's the timeline on that?
For
the case and then the trial and the ruling?
There was a hearing just a few weeks ago, September 27th, I believe it was. Judge Kenney here in Sacramento heard the case on that. A ruling should be coming out sometime in the next 90 days, roughly.
Okay. When we come back, lawsuits aside, what's the future of high-speed rail? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Jeff Morales, CEO of the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Well, there have been repeated calls by Republicans to have a new statewide vote on high-speed rail. A recent USC LA Times poll found that 70% wanted the project to be placed back on the ballot, and that's up from 55% last year. So why shouldn't there be a new vote on high-speed rail?
Mark, I think what we're going through and what we see reflected in some of these polls are kind of the growing pains of actually implementing a project and what it takes to get it done. But it's really important to keep in mind the factors that were behind the passage of 1A in the first place, which voters have reaffirmed several times. The growth in population. Over the next few decades, we're going to be adding the equivalent of the state of New York to California. Our transportation systems are already clogged. They can't handle any more traffic. We're not going to double deck I-5 or the 99. It's just not going to happen. We have to make investments like this in order to continue to grow as a state, in order to maintain our quality of life. That was reflected in the very same poll that talked
Yeah, there
about
was some good news there.
There was some good news. I think people said, again, the underlying reasons for moving forward, they still see them, they still believe them. I think our job is to continue to find ways to make this program more efficient, more effective, bring down costs, accelerate improvements.
Yeah, since I cited that one statistic against you, I want to be fair and cite the statistics for you. That 61% in that same survey said that they think it would help reduce traffic on highways and at airports, and 65% said they thought it would create jobs. So there was some positive news inside of that survey as well. Construction was scheduled to start at the end of 2012, then in early 2013, then in July, then in September. Still, nothing's really started. No dirt has been moved. So what do you say to those who question whether high-speed rail will ever get built?
Oh, we're underway. We're under contract. We're underway. Our first major contract is a design-build contract, meaning the contractor has to finish up the designs before starting the work. One thing I want to go back to your previous question a little bit, and you mentioned jobs, and it's a very important issue, particularly in the Central Valley. Where you look, the unemployment rate is 50% higher than the state average. It's about twice the national average. One of the things that this program will do is, for the first time ever, connect all of the population centers of the state together. Fresno, Bakersfield, with the Bay Area, with the LA region. Every other previous major infrastructure investment in the state has left out the Central Valley. This is a very important project for that and for the future of the state.
I want to ask you about eminent domain. There might be some property owners along the line that don't want to sell. So you go into eminent domain proceedings, but that could be a 1 or 2 year process as that gets taken care of. Is that going to make meeting the federal and state guidelines more difficult?
We've looked at that and taken that into account as we laid out our schedule. We're working through the right-of-way process, through the acquisition of properties. We have procedures in place to streamline it. Our goal and our hope is to acquire as many of the properties as we can without having to go through an eminent domain process. It is a last resort for us, but we've worked through procedures to streamline that, make sure that people's rights are protected, that they're treated fairly, and that we are able to move forward on a timely basis.
It's been noted that if construction starts on January 1st, 2014, to meet the federal deadline, you're going to have to spend $3.75 million a day, including weekends and holidays. And that would be the fastest rate of spending on a major construction project in U.S. history. So is that a realistic burn rate?
Well, I guess a few things. One, I'm not sure I'll vouch for the calculator, whoever made that calculation, but it's an aggressive one, but it is absolutely doable. And I would point to a few things. Is that one, we had 5 world-class teams who bid on our program. Every one of them said they can accomplish it, and several of them said, in fact, ahead of schedule. One thing that's different about this program than what people may normally think of is we're talking about building over a very long stretch. So we could have, in effect, over a 30-mile stretch at this first project, 4 or 5 projects, in effect, going at the same time. So it's very hard to compare our project with a typical one.
The House Transportation Funding Bill includes a Republican draft amendment that would require the Federal Surface Transportation Board to consider the project in its entirety rather than in segments. What would that mean for the project, and how does that impact your ability to secure private funding?
One of the cornerstones of the program has always been the involvement of the private sector, and we have very active interest from the private sector in being a part of this program. Anything that is done in Congress to arbitrarily limit participation in it certainly can have an impact, a negative impact on that. And so we're working to see that that doesn't happen. That's not helpful, and the project should stand on its merits.
Okay, we've only got 30 seconds left in the program. I want to ask you one last quick question, and that is, what are the key dates going forward in 2014? What should people be looking for as a timeline?
Well, a number of things. The electrification of Caltrain will be proceeding forward. That'll be open in 2019 is the projected schedule, and the Central Valley will be underway, under construction in the next few months as we go forward. We're beginning the process of advertising for our next major construction project. So things are happening.
Okay, well, I'm going to thank Jeff Morales, CEO of the High Speed Rail Authority, and Mike Brady, the attorney representing the plaintiffs from Hanford who are suing to stop high-speed rail. If you want to stay current with Valley politics and policy, you can get our free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
I'm Paul Hurley, former community conversation editor for the Visalia Times-Delta and a member of the board of the Kenneth L. Maddy Institute. California's high-speed rail has been anything but a straight shot. It has been slouching toward reality for at least 2 decades. The only ground broken on high-speed rail has been ceremonial. Whenever this train builds momentum, another railroad boulder stops progress. Political, economic, environmental, or all the above. Is this any way to build a railroad? It raises the question whether Californians just don't have the stomach for big projects anymore. At one time, the big public project was a California specialty. Whether it was a massive water system, public university, or freeway project. Ironically, California was built in large part because of one of America's first national public works projects, the Transcontinental Railroad. These days, people are wary of the big project. That's understandable in an era when projects such as the new Bay Bridge take more time and cost considerably more money than expected. Can California even build those kinds of projects anymore? It would be depressing to think that the Golden State, where vision has always been unlimited, has reached its limitations. And should California build those kinds of projects again? If you look at California's issues, you know the answer. Problems such as water quantity and quality, clean air, transportation, and use of resources will only be managed with big solutions. Californians might think the high-speed rail project is impractical and too expensive, but consider the alternative. We're going to want to move people around California more efficiently in the future than our current system of freeways and airports. The solution is out there. Senator Ken Maddy was a visionary for California, but he was also a pragmatist. He believed the way toward progress involved earnest research and sincere dialogue. The Maddy Institute is dedicated to education about public affairs and helping to train our future leaders. They will have to figure out how to make California's big dreams a reality. High-speed rail development in California has been anything but speedy, but it is not, as some claim, the railroad to nowhere. It's still the railroad to the future. And the future is a place where Californians have never been afraid to visit. For the Maddy Report, I'm Paul Hurley.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.